Appendix. Of the land of Bracehall, its form, nature, and climate, of its peoples and their several histories, such as are set forth in that volume of the Winter Chronicles called the Book of the Sword. The authors of the Winter Chronicles were writing, as men must, for their own times. They left much unexplained that we no longer know, and less often explained at length matters we would today take for granted. Also, they were quite rightly concerned with setting down living experience, and not merely telling a coherent tale. In reducing the Book of the Sword to the fashion of such a tale, therefore, much detail has had to be added, and by guesswork, however informed, and much omitted. This account cannot replace what is lost, but may at least round out the picture. Only what is most relevant to the immediate tale is included. Other matters, such as the nature of the Equesh society, must wait until more appropriate points in the narrative. The land. In the years of the long winter, the extent of the land of Bracehall was very great, a vast continent that stretched at its widest some 1,000 leagues from ocean to ocean across the northern world, and from the margins of the ice to the all but impassable southern deserts some 600 or 700 leagues. Within this expanse were many realms, and those of men the least. The events of the Book of the Sword here recounted took place wholly along its western seaboard, in the relatively narrow strip of country, some 130 leagues at its widest, between Meneth Scaris, the Shield Range, and the sea. This was then the furthest flung settlement of the people of Caris, and the newest, being little over 1,000 years old. A natural division to this western strip was the delta of a once great river, now fenland so flat that the sea's influence was felt many leagues inland, while outflowing streams remained fresh, stagnant, or pooled water soon became brackish, turning the area into a vast salt marsh. To the south of it stretched out country that was for the most part open and low-lying, much of it fertile grassland with only one main hilly region along the coast, and few large areas of woodland save around the foothills of the Shield Range. Warm and well-watered, it was ideal land for both grain and livestock, and in the drier, hotter country further south grew many kinds of fruit in profusion. The sea was fished little, and served chiefly for travel. With this, the first settlers, as described by Kermorven in Chapter 5, were well content, since it made possible the city-centered culture they had known in the east. The lands north of the marshes seemed too wild to suit them. These were not only colder, but higher and more hilly, sloping up more steeply to join the mountains, and broken up with thick woodland disturbingly like Papayaula on Aithan, the great forest of evil memory, save in the valleys. The soil was much poorer than in the southlands. Much of the tree and plant life was different, seeming smaller and less rich, and there were many more wild and ferocious animals. For the time being, therefore, it was left little settled and explored, save by solitaries and outlaws, and when the later refugees were hounded from the south, they found the Northlands more to their taste, the people being chiefly of a northern strain in their homeland, and less fond of large cities. The weather, though cooler, was milder and moister in summer, and if the grainland was less, there were rich hill pastures for livestock, and as much game as their hunters could wish. Also, the seas were as rich or richer than in the south. Small fishing communities sprang up along the coast. Less fruit was grown, save in the southernmost valleys around Thunberg, but gradually clearing of the forests provided valuable wood and more farming land, without ever becoming widespread enough to disrupt the natural balance. In general, the northern settlers, both the first-comers and the later brown-skinned peoples from across the ice, adapted to the land rather than mastered it, as in the south. Their population remained therefore smaller and more scattered, and the country between their towns and villages much wilder, even along the high roads. In both North and South, settlement was at its thinnest in the country directly against the mountain slopes, though this was once good land enough and well wooded. In the South, the first settlers had disputed this land with the Duergar, often bloodily, and driven them out. But few who won it prospered, and many a townlet sank into gradual depopulation and decay. In the North, there was less dispute, for the settlers were not so hungry for land, and the Duergar now wary of confronting them. But the spreading influence of the ice across the Nordenberg ranges had the same effect. This, then, was the fashion of Bræsehall's western lands at this time. Of its other and yet greater lands, more is told in later books. But vast as it was, a region as vast again lay on its northern boundary. This, the realm of the great ice. The Long Winter. It may seem strange that the land of Bræsehall could remain so habitable and fertile, even in the north, so close to the margins of the ice. The popular image of an ice age is of a period of eternal winter, a chill world blanketed in perpetual snow and ice, without sun or season. In fact, in the many times of glaciation that have oppressed the world, nothing like this has ever come about. Few living things could long survive such a terrible climate, however well they adapted. At the height of such glaciations, the world as a whole did indeed become colder, but only by a few degrees, on average over a period of time. Even where the grip of the ice was hardest, the seasons would still come and go. We know also of the most recent ice ages that temperatures fell by very different degrees in different parts of the world. Consequences would therefore vary greatly, and the changes they wrought thus be subtler and more gradual. One such would be a drop in sea level, laying bare much new land, since so much water was now frozen, and the consequent disruption of the cycle of water between air and river and ocean. This, in turn, would change the patterns of wind and clouds, and the cycles of rainfall that depended upon them. In many places, this would cause or worsen droughts, so that hot, but lush and well-watered lands might lose much of their water, but, being far from the ice, little of their heat. They would then become parched, and the deserts spread. This might explain why the equatorial lands of Bræsehall became uninhabitable, impassable deserts, with corresponding zones of calm at sea. But contrary to what one might expect, the changes wrought in northern lands could easily have been less severe. The lands immediately bordering the glaciers would soon be reduced to the frozen wastelands called tundra, as did indeed happen in the heartland beyond the Shield Range. But even there, this did not spread as far south as the ice as the modern tundra, no more than 150 leagues at its fullest extent. This was probably because the glaciers thrust forward beyond the colder northern latitudes into warmer, lower lands, where a stalemate developed between their chill and the original climate. Where there was a natural barrier such as the Nordenberg Ranges to hold back the glaciers, their effect seems to have been even less drastic. The temperate northlands suffered severer winters, but spring and summer, though shorter, still came in much of their former warmth. Also, it has been shown that a great mass of ice tends to deflect cyclonic storms southward. The weather may have become stormier, therefore, but rainfall increased, making the land richer for plant life. Certainly a kind of rainforest grew in the north at this time, like that in southern lands, but made up of different, temperate vegetation. And it is known that some barren desert lands grew green and wooded. All in all, it seems that the glaciers had not then so much overrun warmer zones, as squeezed them closer together and heightened their extremes, reducing the distance between the coldest and hottest zones. One could travel from icebound lands through cool, temperate forests to warm grainlands and subtropical orchards in a much shorter time. But that is not to minimize the menace of the ice. The balance of the world is delicate, and needs no immense fall in its mean temperature to wreak havoc on all living things. Such may have been the first intention of the ice, but there was a worse one, for ice breeds ice in many ways. A great mass of it must increase the world's whiteness, mirroring back much of the heat of the sun and gradually cooling the air around and ahead of it. If that air becomes too cold, as in the depths of a hard winter, it allows the glaciers to spread further and chills the ice caps of mountains in their path till they too grow and become glaciers, as Ansgar accurately describes. He may have seen it happen over a succession of winters. Those glaciers would in turn link up with the greater ice to reflect more heat and repeat the cycle further ahead, exponential process with only one logical end. In that process, there must be a single crucial point at which it becomes self-sustaining, for so much heat is being reflected that even high summer in either hemisphere cannot raise the temperature of the world enough to drive back the ice, and it begins to spread without seasonal check. No improvement in the climate would then be possible, and in a very short time, an imprisoning shell of ice would close from both poles to the equator. Popular picture of an ice age come fatally and permanently true. That crucial point, obviously, has not so far been passed. But in these years of the Winter Chronicles, all unknown to Elof, it was drawing very near. The peoples. The people of the Southlands. The first men who came to the Southlands were rovers from the eastern colonies, many of them landless and outlaws. It was they who first clashed with the Duergar of the region, who had formerly roamed at will in that rich country without any thought of claiming it for themselves. But the newcomers were bold and ruthless men, who had survived the many perils of the forest, and were little disposed to favor any save themselves. A few small settlements were founded, but were destroyed in a generation or less by either the Duergar or internal strife. A few survivors only straggled back eastward, but with tales of the fine land that awaited proper settlement. Understandably, however, none were too eager to risk such a venture until the ice began to menace the eastern colonies, and the climate grew colder. The majority of the colonists were descended from the southern race of Caris, the Penruthia, Aruthia in the northern language, and kept their forefathers' preference for a warmer clime, which suited the farming they knew best. A desire grew among them to risk the journey southwestward, but this their kings resisted. They knew that only a strong realm could hope to withstand the ice. Nevertheless, dissension grew, swelled perhaps by secret voluntaries of the ice, as its sinister glitter drew ever nearer the horizon. Conspiracies were formed to plan flight, or escape as they called it, and all through one late summer and autumn, whole communities left their land and straggled off by one route or another westward. The then king, Aaron IV, might have prevented it with his soldiers, who remained largely loyal, but he was unwilling to start strife that would only aid the ice. The fate of such ignorant and ill-planned expeditions in the perilous heartland of Bracehall can be imagined. Little more than 1/3 of those who set out won through to the coast, but these were principally the best organized and led, and their settlement this time was well chosen and established, a natural harbor among rich and varied country. This they called Bryhain, the land of freedom, its heart their walled city. But they cast aside all the traditions of Caris, for the men of wealth and power who had led the expeditions rejected any kind of kingship and established themselves as a governing body, the Syndicacy, members of which was governed by contributions to the public coffers. The Syndicacy then went further and made Kerbrahain a purely Penruthia settlement, where their tongue alone could be spoken. However, they did not otherwise persecute those of northern stock who had come with them. Such was the founding of Brihane. From the very beginning, it prospered. The people of the Northlands. The race that came from the northern lands of Karis called themselves Svarhath, but were named by Southrons Runduathia. They looked much like their southern cousins, but ran rather to dark hair than to red, and to breadth rather than great height. By nature they were more taciturn and secretive, wise and deep delving rather than merry and outgoing. They tended to mysticism and deep study, at their worst to fanaticism, treason, and stratagem, but at their best to great loyalty, wisdom, and strength of will. Thus it was that the majority of them held fast by their lord against the advancing ice. But Charon V could not, or would not, see that his realm was now too weak, would not spare what resources remained to prepare any refuge. So when at last the ice rolled over the east, most of those who were not slain fled westward in as poor a state or worse than the earlier fugitives. A few held fast, determined to defend the remaining smaller towns of their realm, though king and city had fallen. By good fortune, those who fled found a leader, though an unwilling one, in the great hero Vade, who had lately won his way to them over the ocean from Karis, one of the last to do so. He it was brought them across Bracehall with small loss, and at last to Brihane. There they found scant welcome, and as the years passed, anger grew between the two peoples, swelling at last to terrible strife. Vade, already old beyond the common years of men, engineered his people's escape northward across the marshlands at the cost of many lives, including, it is said, his own. So the realm of Norderney began in blood, and this, perhaps, was why it never became a truly sound country. Vade, had he lived, might have united it, but without him men drifted apart, weary and distrustful, seeking only to live their own lives in peace. Small towns sprang up everywhere, generally around the households of wealthy men and chieftains. They were small and scattered. The realm might well have been too weak to hold together long, but some 150 years after the first settlements, a new people began to drift into the northern territories. Strong, sturdy folk with strange set eyes, black hair, and skin the color of dark leather. They came chiefly in boats, from crude skin craft to huge black-hulled galleys, sailing westward along the dangerous margins of the ice in search of new lands to settle. For they too were refugees from the ice, which was overrunning their western homeland, and from the growing power of a strange, cruel nation which was profiting from the disorder. The northerners, remembering their own misfortunes, and with plenty of land to spare, made them welcome. They were well repaid, for the newcomers, a lively and industrious people, well used to living in cool lands not far from the ice, swiftly learned the ways and the tongue of the people of Karis, and joined with them in increasing the worth and strength of the land, the wealth of the townships. Some grew quite large, though never to a fraction the size and stature of Kerbrahine. Without the newcomers, Norderney might not have survived. In time, they so mingled with the first settlers that a pure white skin became a rarity, and sometimes ill thought of, especially in the most northerly lands. It was mutual trade and the demands of trade that came to hold the Northland towns together, and the guild systems, inherited from the East, became of signal importance. Within a generation, too, there was trade with Brihine, which, no longer threatened, may have felt some shame and remorse for its former harshness. As the years passed into centuries, the two realms settled into mutual acceptance, though the bonds of friendship that had created the strength of Karis were never renewed. Strong links were forged by the traveling traders, and these lasted for many hundreds of years. But otherwise, the two realms lived lives apart, neither knowing nor caring much about the other save as it affected their trade. So it was that neither saw the slow decaying that settled on them both, which a union of their sundered strengths might have helped resist. The lawmakers and their guilds. Or the lawmakers and the guilds. The guilds were almost the only authorities common to Northland and Southland, and even that link was tenuous. They had common roots in both realms, and before that in the lost lands of the East. But by Elof's time, they had grown far apart, most notably in the influence they enjoyed. Rule and order in the north were clearly left to each town to sort out for itself. In larger towns, some kind of elected council usually directed day-to-day affairs. But in smaller towns, it was commonest to find a more or less autocratic headman, either hereditary or chosen by a council of elders. Law was therefore a strictly local matter, but the rules and standards set by the guilds, which the townships had to enforce, provided an element of continuity, as these covered such matters as fair trading, quality, weights and measures, contract enforcement, employment and apprenticeship. They concerned almost every aspect of life and were a strong stabilizing influence. The guilds, therefore, wielded great political power, becoming the nearest thing to a government in Norderney. They encouraged the leaguing of towns for mutual defense and the protection of trade. In the Southlands, by contrast, power lay squarely in the hands of the syndicacy. In peacetime, it was principally a lawmaking council, usually dominated by one or two powerful personalities who were the city marshals, commanders of the guard, an armed constabulary. In emergencies, such as the Equish invasion, however, the guard became the nucleus of a citizen army, and the syndics became commanders under the guidance of the marshals, directing the actual fighting if they were warriors, supervising watchkeeping, firefighting, and food rationing if they were not. Otherwise, individual syndics enjoyed prestige and influence, especially if they sat as magistrates in the city courts, but no personal power. Exceptions to this were the march wardens, syndics from the warrior class charged with defending the borders. In practice, this usually meant suppressing bands of outlaws and corsairs, rather than actual war. As the syndicacy grew complacent and corrupt, strong march wardens could often make themselves all-powerful within their domain. In Bryhain, therefore, the guilds were no more than trade and craft organizations, even their rules subject to ratification by the syndicacy. Their political power was slight, save when members would band together to finance a representative for the syndicacy. Cetahain was one such, for though his personal wealth was instrumental, he could not have managed all the high contributions on his own. Sometimes a powerful guild might put pressure on the syndicacy. The Farmers' Guild had some prestige, for many land-owning syndics were members, and the Mariners' Guild, directly descended from that of Karis itself, jealously maintained the privilege of legislating sea traffic. But there was never any doubt where the ultimate authority lay. Once only did the guilds of both lands work together, and that was in the early days when enmities had faded. Both realms were wealthy, and trade was expanding. Then they came together, with the guarded blessings of the syndicacy and the larger northern towns, and built the great causeway across the marshlands, replacing the former crazy mix of half-flooded trails, short stretches of embanked wagon track, and rickety bridges. They also began the extension of the high roads into Norderney, but this was completed in later years by the North alone. The Duergar. The Duergar race is so hedged about with mystery that it is hard to form a clear picture of their ultimate origins, though more is said about their history in later books. Their strange subterranean way of life, their great wisdom and craft, their long lifespans, diminished form, and secretive natures are matters of legend, and in the days of their power, few besides Elof and Kermorven were privileged to see beyond that. But despite the accretions of myth, there is no doubt that they were an ancient offshoot of the same mortal stock as men. They often named themselves the Elders, and angrily rued the coming of humans as one would the growth of ungrateful and unruly children. Some clues may also be found in the detailed physical descriptions in the chronicles. These reflect an anatomical pattern consistent with one particular race of men whose limb bones are characteristically short and slightly bowed, with very strong marked points of muscle attachment, indicating a stocky build and remarkable strength. Their skulls appear low-vaulted, giving a sloping forehead, but the average brain capacity is actually larger. The heavy jaw and straight-lined chin, neither receding nor protruding, is also characteristic of later forms of the only accepted subspecies of man, Homo sapiens solensis or Neanderthalensis. The popular picture of Neanderthal man is still seriously distorted by early studies of the first remains identified, which suffered from the preconceptions of the scientists and their failure to see that the bones were those of an old man crippled with arthritis. The brain capacity alone should have alerted them, but the image of a shambling caveman they produced has proved hard to dispel. In actual fact, a Neanderthal man would look little more unusual among later men than an Eskimo, and many Neanderthal skull and facial features can still be found as individual variations of Homo sapiens sapiens, except, that is, for the larger brain. Interestingly enough, many authorities regard Neanderthal characteristics as specialized adaptations to an unusually cold climate. If such an identification is possible, it is an important factor in dating the chronicles, and something of a problem. Neanderthalers vanished as a separate type some 40,000 to 35,000 years ago, in the middle phase of the last glaciation. Some theories suggest that they were exterminated by Homo sapiens, others that they interbred with him, a view that surviving traits, such as a low bump at the rear curve of the skull, would support. A third possibility, indicated by the little the Duergar would reveal of their own traditions, is that their own ancient civilization was of old assailed by the ice and the coming of men, and only preserved by the intervention of Ilmarinen, whom they revered, in making their refuges in the hollow hills. As later books of the Chronicles indicate, there is probably some truth in all three. At the time of the Chronicles, the Duergar way of life, as indicated in chapters 7 and 8, suggests a relatively small population, widely scattered. But the sheer size of their underground realm, running the entire length of the Shield Range, equally suggests a much larger population, and there is little doubt that in their isolation the Duergar were in decline. Why this was is uncertain. Their food supplies were undoubtedly plentiful. They grew food on inaccessible mountain terraces, not unlike those around Inca cities, whose entire topsoil was hauled up the high slopes on the backs of porters. Some livestock, including strains of mountain goat, was raised there also, but meat did not play a large part in their diet. It was not unlike traditional Chinese fare, strongly based on grain, vegetables, and the fish in which their rivers abounded, and generally well balanced. The health of the Duergar was naturally good, and their knowledge of healing deep. There are no records of plagues or recurrent disease. The cause of their decline seems to have been spiritual rather than physical, and very probably Elof caught it exactly when he questioned their purpose in the world. Many Duergar seem to have felt the lack of a purpose, and yet so mistrusted the outside world that they could not bring themselves to seek it. Ansgar was unusual in his understanding of men, and undoubtedly he and Ilse strove to appear as natural to them as they could. The commoner Duergar personality seems to have been much stranger and more remote. others. Such were the chief peoples of western Bracehaul at this time. There were many others on its borders, such as the children of Tapaiao, whose true home was elsewhere in the land, and the Ekwesh, at this time still sailing back to their homelands across the western oceans. More is said of these later in the chronicles, but it is possible that there should be one more addition to the races of men. These are the snow trolls, for, strange and monstrous as they were, they wore man's shape in a land where no ape has ever come. But since they were creatures of the ice, it is possible that they were born from the far west, the harsh homelands of the Ekwesh along the margins of the ice. Certainly, some remains have been found there, principally enormous teeth, of a vast creature that must have stood half again as tall as a man, and with far greater bulk. Significantly, it has been suggested that the huge growth of these creatures, called Gigantopithecus, was another kind of adaptation to the ice. And although such remains as have been found date from an earlier season of the long winter, it may be equally significant that legends of similar creatures yet persist on both sides of the Western Ocean and in the same areas. Languages of the two lands. Original texts of the Winter Chronicles are written in the ideographic script of Keris, which was largely common to both northern and southern tongues. Because each word is depicted by an ideograph and not actually spelt out, it is not always possible to tell which of the two tongues is being spoken in the text. I've tried to suggest this, though, where the context permits. More seriously, it is not always known how words sounded, even though their meaning is known. Direct equivalents cannot easily be traced in a living tongue, as was done with Egyptian hieroglyphics and Coptic, and this creates a problem. Each tongue has its own strongly individual character. One, the Svarhath, was distinctly northern in character, being somewhat hard-edged and harsh. The southern tongue, Penruthia, was softer and more rolling, and at the same time more elaborately formal. The names and terms we do know in these tongues make it certain that they were broadly ancestral to the Indo-European families, especially those strains which were to develop into the various languages of northwestern Europe, sometimes defined as the Kentum tongues, from the common term for 100. In particular, they were remarkably close to the Germanic or Scandinavian and Celtic families respectively. So, to preserve their individuality, the spellings of names and other words have Scandinavian or Celtic flavors, as appropriate. It is important to remember, though, that they were not as different as this suggests. Scandinavian and German would be a better example in that respect. More than half their vocabulary came from similar roots, though differently developed and pronounced, and the grammatical structure was broadly similar. Not so the final effect. Penruthia speakers found Svarharth furry and somewhat uncouth. Svarhath speakers thought Penruthia clear but inexpressive, but neither found the other's tongue especially hard to learn, especially in written form, since the same ideograph served for both languages. This is probably why the various alphabetical scripts that existed never entered common usage, and were thought of as almost as codes or cryptograms. Probably, many of the Mastersmith's books were written in alphabetical characters. It is interesting that at one point in the Book of the Sword, Hermorvin, through modesty or caution, very definitely speaks in Svarhath when the subject would suggest his native tongue. This is his brief account of the fall of the great eastern city, in which he uses the northern form of its name, the Strandenberg, here rendered City by the Waters. His reasons are made clear in the Book of the Helm. Other tongues. Little can be said about these at this stage. Most Duergar knew the northern tongue, Anvar spoke an old and rather literary form of it, but it is noticeable that most other Duergar spoke in a broad, colloquial fashion, suggesting a preference for informality in their own tongue. Elof and Kermorven did undoubtedly learn some of the difficult Duergar language, but very little of it is preserved. It looks at first sight almost Slavic, but has an inescapable resemblance to Finno-Ugrian tongues. More is said of this and of the Ekwesh tongues in later books. Ships. Descriptions of 3 different types appear in the Book of the Sword. From these, and occasional marginal illustrations and illumination, it is possible to make reasonably informed reconstructions. Ekwesh galleys. The Ekwesh raiding ships were the most feared warships of their day. As the vessels described in Chapter 1 do not appear to have been bireme types, which would probably not have been very seaworthy in an open ocean, it is possible to make a rough estimate of their length from the number of oars per side. To be used freely, these would have to be about 3 feet apart, but in a fast raiding vessel, no more than that. A length of 100 feet would not be unreasonable. Also, to be as hard to see as they were, the ships must have ridden quite low in the water. We know also that they were relatively sleek and narrow-beamed, and had at most partial decking to cover the cargo. All this fits a recognizable pattern. These vessels, like many primitive warships, were extreme sophistications of the war canoe form, but given great speed and carrying capacity by the addition of a sail. This, as in most other ships of the time, was a simple square. Descriptions in the chronicles and details such as the heavy tarred cord reinforcements suggest that the Ekwesh had mastered the use of it across the wind, and even in some cases against it. Illumination and marginal illustrations, though stylized, bear this out. The warships described in Chapter 1 seem to have been typical of the earlier days of the Ekwesh expansion. It is significant, though, that they were definitely smaller than the ones described in Chapter 5. Even when laden with booty, these ride substantially higher in the water than the Corsair craft, and are described as being at least half again as long, probably something of an understatement. They have full decking and some kind of stern castle, and holds big enough for prisoners and booty. Evidently, the Ekwesh had begun to build larger and more sophisticated vessels to carry larger raiding parties and richer pickings. Some of this may have been the mastersmith's influence, but there is little doubt that it would have happened anyway. The Corsair craft. This seems to have been a typically small warcraft of Brihane. The spiked ram was characteristic, a useful weapon that could not only penetrate an enemy's planking, but hold to it for boarding, unlike most Ekwesh ships which rammed only to sink, having either reinforced lower bows or using a heavy beam with metal sheathing, which often glanced off springy planking. The Corsair's tally of oars suggests a length of around 60 feet, possibly more. It was probably more strongly built than Ekwesh vessels, somewhat broader in the beam and less subtly shaped, relying on its smaller size and proportionally larger sail area for any advantage in speed. It seems to have had very little decking, save platforms at bow and stern to cover the cargo, and the journey back with 22 women on board, described in Chapter 5, must have been somewhat arduous, though no doubt preferable to the Ekwesh holds. Duergar courier boat. Although this was built only for fast sailing on calm, underground waterways, it seems to have been of a very advanced construction for the time, and this no doubt is why the one carrying Kermorven, Ills, and Elof was able to survive in the open sea for as long as it did. Under 30 feet long, it seems to have had the narrow hull typical of waterway boats, but with a sharp vertical bow, and fortunately a somewhat deeper draft. Being fully decked with bulkhead compartments beneath probably strengthened it. Its rig was unusual, the sail area much larger and baggier than normal to catch the gentle breezes of the tunnel system, and having a small extra topsail. This was not normally furled, but lowered against the mainsail, as on Norwegian femboring craft. Remarks in the text suggest that the larger Duergar craft normally had multiple sails, and perhaps quite complex rigs, though no doubt of a very specialized kind. Other unusual features of the courier boat were a pivoted rudder rather than a steering oar, and the use of winches to allow one person to sail the craft from the tiller, possibly aided by some spring or counterweight mechanism. Without these, it might not have been possible to control such a sail in any strong sea wind. In fact, even when the leeboard improvised by Kermorven, a feature still seen on traditional Netherland design, it is remarkable that the little craft carried the three travelers as far as it did without a capsize. Flora and fauna. It is an indication of the slow effect of the ice, despite the compression of climactic zones mentioned earlier, that so much of the life in these lands was little different from recent forms, except that in many ways it was richer. What the ice could not do, the settlements of men have achieved. So, many plants and animals mentioned in the chronicles are easily identified, and need no comment. They are much the same as modern forms inhabiting these areas, or similar areas elsewhere. This last is particularly true of regions like the marshlands, whose sharp and sinister black rushes, Juncus gradi and Romerianus, survive to torment walkers in modern salt marshes. But even a slightly colder climate can dramatically alter habitats, and many strange creatures found places among these lands that now dwell elsewhere, or have vanished altogether. The creatures of the ice. As to the strange and fearful beasts unleashed by the ice, little can be said with certainty. If they were not created by it, they were distorted and ruined, a living mockery and vengeance upon life itself. It is significant that the chronicles give them names in the tongues of the Duergar, who knew them of old. The dragon they called Arachek, the great lizard thing, Aksawan. It is some witness to the terror they wielded that recognizable images of both names and beast yet survive in the folklore of what was once the Northlands. The same, let it be said, is true of Amakak, the sea devourer. But terror though he was no servant of the ice. Domesticated plants and animals. The chronicles give us relatively little detail about most of these, whether the goats on the Duergar's mountain pastures were some kind of mountain goat or sheep, for example. But in one or two cases, it is possible to say more. Horses. These may have been a breed imported from Caris, which did not survive the great changes that were to come. But a reference in one place to a stiff mane and elsewhere to a small size suggests that some, at least, were the primitive native breed, which probably resembled Przewalski's horse. It spread throughout these lands and into the far south, but became wholly extinct before modern times. Cattle, Chapter 1. The cattle the boy Alv herded resemble no modern breed. Indeed, their immense size and span of horns suggest that they were a very early domestication of the giant wild cattle, the aurochs. This only became extinct in 1627, and all domestic cattle are descended from it. It is interesting that the rare semi-wild cattle of the Chillingham breed, though much smaller, are the same off-white color. They are also so fierce as to be barely manageable without, perhaps, such a goad. Wild animals. Carnivores, Chapter 2. The beasts that attacked the Mastersmith's party cannot be identified for certain. The description does not fit the commonest carnivores of the period, Canis dirus or direwolves. More probably they were the rare Chasmaporthetus, a relation of the hyena, but with a build and dentition more like that of a cheetah. Daggertooth, Chapter 2. Two beasts have been known by this name, either Smilodon, the classic saber-toothed tiger, or its slightly smaller relation, Homotherium, the biting cat that killed the large beaver. Casseroides was probably a closer ancestor of the puma. Wisents, Chapter 4. Wisent, or Wisent, is another name for the bison, then a newcomer to these lands and still evidently retaining its forest-dwelling habits. It is only after the end of the long winter that its descendants, the buffalo, spread out across the plains. Hounds of Nereid, Chapter 9. These are correctly identified as whales. Their eerie songs reverberating through the hulls of small ships can still startle modern crews. They sing chiefly in calm water, though not while hunting. Also, the description fits no known living breed. The elongated body twice the length of the boat, making it around 60 feet. The long jaws with large, widespread teeth. The dermal armor and apparent lack of any dorsal fin might, however, describe a member of the Archaeoceti, often called Zeuglodons, after their best-known members. These are an ancient family of whales parallel with, not ancestral to, modern forms, and believed to have been extinct for some millions of years. This would make them a rather startling anachronism in the relatively recent period of the Chronicles. But it is worth considering that creatures of serpentine shape are not uncommonly sighted at sea even yet. Mammut, Chapter 9. The actual name used is Ksalhat, but the Old Russian form Mammut has been substituted, as this beast sounds more like a species of woolly mammoth, probably Mammuthus columbi. Despite reconstructions showing it on snowbound tundra, it was almost certainly a forest animal for most of the year. The sole doubt arises from the size of the beast described. Some woolly mammoths were no larger than Indian elephants. It could instead have been some long-haired breed of mastodon. Several kinds were common in Bracehall during the long winter. Many larger than woolly mammoths, and with tusks of terrifying proportions. Interestingly enough, the Yukagir tribes who today inhabit what must once have been part of the Ekwesh realm, still name the beast Zolhut. The forests. The coastal and giant redwoods Sequoia sempervirens and Sequoia dendron giganteum seem to have dominated most of the western coastal forests at this period, as indeed they did until very recently. Understandably, therefore, the forests closely resembled those that survive there today, though naturally they lacked introduced species such as eucalyptus, whose fragrance floods modern woodlands. Then, they must have smelt largely of resiny evergreen, because beside the redwoods they had the almost equally gigantic cedars and firs found today, the bristlecone pine and many other kinds of evergreen. Deciduous trees were a minority, but a substantial one. In northern areas, however, a kind of tree is described which can only be the so-called dawn redwood, Metasequoia, an ancient cousin of the giants, and at about 60 feet high, relatively small. It must already have been rare until recently, when specimens were rediscovered in China. It was long thought to have been extinct. Religion. This is one of the hardest subjects to comment on, for although the people of Karis were aware of forces at work in the world, feared some and respected others, they rarely turned to formal worship of either. When they did, it was usually to darker forces. These tendencies seem to have endured in their descendants. By the time of the Chronicles, though, the settlers in the West were already losing their ancient knowledge of the powers, both favorable and hostile. and the will that lay behind them. That knowledge was absorbed into the animistic beliefs of the newcomers, more comprehensible to a large peasant society, and relegated to folk legend. For example, the royal banner of the Lost Lands showed Raven flying across the sun, leading men to its light. But this eventually became transmuted to a tale of Raven stealing the sun for mankind. So it has endured. In the Southlands, greater wisdom has preserved, but it had hardened, or fossilized, into patriotic and civic ritual. To a sophisticated Southron such as Kermorvan, an appearance of Raven would be like a statue stepping down off its pedestal, Athena appearing to Pericles. Common to both countries, though, was a concept of afterlife they called the river. This they saw as a barrier to an afterworld beyond perception or return, except possibly by dark arts. That image may in part derive from the dark regions of tundra and taiga forest that always spread ahead of the ice, lands crossed by a network of rivers icy with meltwater. For these were the realm and preserve of Tayun. There the dead were ever to be found. Equesh religion. Though a full account of the Equesh society and the strange forces at work within it belongs in later volumes, some account of their religion should be given here. Its blacker side was well known, but Kermorvan had evidently learned something more. In its original form, it was the same simple animism as that of the other peoples of their land. As the Equesh grew stronger, their religion came to be dominated by the shamans, who became powers in the clans second only to the chieftains. In some cases, they wielded more power, or real power. Their rites involved dancing to drums and ecstatic, visionary frenzies in which their pronouncements were regarded as oracular. At this stage, they still retained some recognition and reverence of the powers, but a new element gradually began to intrude itself: the outright worship of the advancing ice. This was organized as a kind of secret society or mystery religion among the upper echelons of the clans, to which only the elect and powerful were admitted. It drastically changed the character of their society. The cannibalism that made them so greatly loathed and dreaded was apparently an ancient custom, probably encouraged by the dwindling of food supplies as the ice overran their lands. But originally, it had been a funeral rite, intended to honor and perpetuate the dead by absorbing their wisdom and bravery. The new cult made it a rite of debasement and domination, fattening on thralls. It fits the pattern of a society being systemically corrupted and turned against its neighbors. And, indeed, it appears that the ice cult made deliberate use of even greater atrocities in its rituals to create a dark bond among its votaries and heighten their ruthlessness. Similar ideas have been attributed to recent cults such as Thuggee in India and Anioto and Mau Mau in Africa. Smithcraft. True smithcraft had a definite religious significance in the Northland. Smiths' work was an act of secondary creation, linking them to the shaping powers and their creator. Though by the time of the Chronicles it was somewhat taken for granted, it kept a great civic importance. The townsmith was a privileged citizen, responsible more to his guild than the town authorities. He was usually the best educated man in small villages, and through his journeyman's wanderings the most widely traveled. He would marry couples over his anvil, symbolically joining them as the rings he forged for them. Later, he would name their children, and in the smaller towns might also give them an elementary education. Most smiths, though, remained little more than smiths, never achieving mastership. Those who did might simply be accomplished craftsmen, like Joran. But often they were already wealthy enough to rise above the day-to-day business of smiths, and devote themselves to civic affairs, fine art, or even scholarship in natural philosophy. A few individuals, however, turned to personal ambition. The people of Bryhane regarded smithcraft as mere superstition, but nevertheless flocked to buy the work of northern smiths in preference to their own. Certainly, it had a fixed base of ritual in the introduction of music, verse, pattern, and shaping at various stages of the creative process. These were seen as expressing and harnessing the power or talent latent within the smith. Music or verse might come first. Music was generally held to be the more intense influence on the work, but for the reason the less finely controlled, the words gave direction to the intensity. The pattern caught and bound the influence thus expressed, and the completed shaping of the piece gave it the necessary identity. In the Duergar, the power of true smithcraft seems to have been more evenly spread than in ordinary men, with fewer troughs and peaks among individuals. That, and the immense reserve of experience maintained in a long-lived and stable society, gave them an advantage. But a truly powerful human smith could often achieve much more, and create work of startling intensity, if only he had the skill. True smithcraft did not automatically confer skill in working metal, but the greater the skill, the more it was intensified. And such skill there must certainly have been, in the years of the Chronicles. Metalworking, especially among the Duergar, reached heights that have barely been equaled. The making of Kermorvan's sword, as recounted in Chapter 7, is a fair summing up of the process by which ulat steel was made, the secret of the ancient swordsmiths of Damocus. The oiled silk patterns and the golden sheen were characteristic. That technique produced a carbon steel, combining elasticity with great strength, that even advanced industrial processes have not matched. The Damascus smiths did not understand how their process achieved this, and neither did modern researchers until recently. Elof and his Duergar master evidently understood it perfectly. It is worth noting that the metalworking long remained something of a separate and mysterious art, even in societies that had lost all memory of true smithcraft. Among the Tuareg of northern Africa, the smiths form a separate caste, in some ways inferior, but respected in others. The curse of a smith is not taken lightly. And in our own society, the village smith was a powerful figure in folklore, especially folk medicine, a kenning man by virtue of his profession. The Chronicles. In Kerbrahane, the recording of history was something of a religious exercise, drawing moral guidance and lessons from the errors of the past. And it was probably some surviving aura of this that caused the Winter Chronicles to be preserved when so much else was lost. Numerous things to be copied and recopied, even when their meaning had entirely faded. Although the date they were written cannot now be said for certain, there is no doubt that the world they record is not so very remote. In its vast age, the world has endured many long winters, many ages when the polar ice has thrust its crushing fingers outward across warmer lands. But only in the 4 great glaciations of the most recent, or Quaternary era, can there have been men to record them. There are other indications which may narrow the field further. We have seen that the world of the Winter Chronicles bore a great likeness to our own. Its plants and animals, despite some slight inconsistencies and archaic forms, are recent enough to be recognizable in such of the same habitats as man has spared. Even more striking are the maps in some chronicles, when we translate them from different mapping conventions and projection techniques, as has been done for the end paper map, and allow for the greater width of coastal land exposed by the drop in sea level at the time. The resulting coastline is recognizably recent. All these strong similarities suggest the most recent of the four glaciations, known as the Worm or Wixelian, and in America, the Wisconsinian. This is generally agreed to have reached its height some 18,000 years ago. Its rise was slow, its decline remarkably rapid, and it is at the height of just such a major glaciation that the events of the Book of the Sword occurred.